recorded message from Dame Callie Palmer, who's the National Cancer Director of the National Health Service in England, and then we'll go ahead and get started following her recorded message with the rest of our program.
Hello, I'm Callie Palmer, National Cancer Director for NHS England and Improvement. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to London Global Cancer Week 2020. The aim of London Global Cancer Week is to really focus on improving survival in low to middle income countries so that we can make a difference to people experiencing cancer and the effects of cancer around the world, and together help to improve survival. I'm delighted that the UK has played a leading role in convening London Global Cancer Week this year. There are going to be 24 virtual events running from Sunday the 15th through to Friday the 20th of November, really focusing on action and practical steps to help improve support for people around the world. Thank you for joining. We have a number of organisations contributing, including WHO and the Commonwealth. It's a fantastic collaboration of people and teams to help us all make a difference. And I really look forward to hearing the outcomes of the week. And I'm sure it'll be inspiring, moving, and a really important week for all of us. Thank you.
Great, so thanks so much. Let me try to pull my slides up. Great, so thanks again to all of you for joining. I think we still have people filtering in. I know this is maybe at somewhat awkward times for many of you, and we appreciate people joining from various parts of the world, even if the time isn't the most convenient. We are really grateful from the National Cancer Institute Center for Global Health for this opportunity. I'm hearing some background noise. I don't know if that's okay. So regardless, I'd really like to thank the organizers of London Global Cancer Week for inviting us from the NCI Center for Global Health to host this session on the final day of what's been, I think, a really exciting week. We were asked to speak specifically from the NCI perspective about international collaboration to advance global cancer research. We have some amazing speakers, all of whom are NCI-supported investigators, I think, doing really exciting work in LMICs. And so I want to just offer some opening comments really to set the stage for their presentations about some of the exciting work that they're doing. So the first is just to simply, I know people have heard about this throughout the week, kind of why international collaboration. And I think, just to offer my perspectives on this quite briefly, I think the justification for international collaboration is quite straightforward. I think there are clear moral and mathematical arguments for international collaboration simply based on burden. So many of you are familiar with these global can estimates. But in 2018, 18 million cancer cases per year globally. And in 2040, a projected 29 million cancer cases globally. Those may be actually underestimates, given that they're largely based simply on demographic changes, and cancer incidence in many LMICs is actually increasing. And then shown at right are the probability of premature death in high-income countries shown in black and low-income countries shown in red. And you can see that already in 2020, the probability of premature death in low-income countries exceeds that in high-income countries. Perhaps more alarmingly, shown in these circles are the Sustainable Development Goal targets. And you can see that while we're not quite on track to reach the target, the 2030 target in high-income countries, we are at least making very steady progress toward that, whereas you see much less of a decline in low-income countries. So all of this is to say that, in 2040, it's estimated that approximately 30% of cancer will occur in high-income countries and 70% in low-income countries. So the moral argument then which I think is quite clear, is this is an immense amount of human suffering, much of which could be prevented or mitigated, and we have a moral obligation to address that. And certainly my entire kind of academic and professional life before coming to the NCI, I think attests to that personal view. However, I think there's a strong scientific argument as well, simply based on burden. That is, if in 2040, 30% of the cancer occurs in the world occurs in high income countries, I think it, is incredibly restrictive on the scientific enterprise to solely study that 30% of cancer. We would never presume to or propose to study, for example, 30% of the genome, or analyze data from 30% of trial participants that we had enrolled in a study of a new investigational agent. So similarly, I think it seems fairly obvious that the scientific enterprise related to cancer will be severely restricted if we don't undertake international collaboration in low-income countries specifically. So, I think the scientific justification also arises not just from burden, but from cancer incidence heterogeneity around the world. So, again, I think the burden argument in many cases, in many instances, is sufficient. But on top of that, cancer incidence is, of course, not distributed uniformly around the world. So, for example, some cancers like prostate cancer, shown in this gray color, breast cancer, shown in this pink color, are very common around the world. And it seems obvious that we will be able to understand these complex cancers better if we study them in different populations, diverse health systems, and different geographic settings. Similarly, other cancers, for example, cervical cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, are malignancies that occur in high-income countries, but fairly infrequently. Whereas cervical cancer, for instance, is very common in parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Kaposi sarcoma is the most common cancer in the overall population in just a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it'll be very difficult to make progress for these malignancies without international collaboration. So I think reflecting in part both this moral and scientific justification, the NCI created a Center for Global Health, which I now direct, in 2011. And this was an initiative by Dr. Harold Varmus, who was the NCI director at the time. And when the Center for Global Health was created, they wrote that we have recently established the NCI Center for Global Health, which will develop an appropriate research strategy to help incorporate cancer control into global health programs, foster relevant research activities throughout the NCI's own extramural and intramural divisions, and work closely with the many potential collaborators who have displayed an interest in shared objectives. Strikingly, they wrote, many questions are not only relevant to cancer in the developing world, they address problems that can be solved only by giving more attention to cancers in other parts of the globe. We're very excited about celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Center for Global Health next year, and really looking forward to the second decade of CGH at the NCI. I often like to point out that CGH, or the Center for Global Health, is really one part of the NCI, which is a big, complex organization. And certainly global health activity at the NCI preceded the initiation of the Center for Global Health in 2011. And even now, global health activity is really distributed across the divisions, offices, and centers of the NCI. So the NCI was established by the National Cancer Institute Act of 1937, and in its current form by the National Cancer Act of 1971. The NCI leads, conducts, and supports cancer research across the nation to advance scientific knowledge and help all people live longer, healthier lives. The FY20 annual budget was $6.25 billion US. And again, even though there is global health activity occurring across the NCI, we at the Center for Global Health are unique among NCI centers, divisions, offices, and centers in having a primary focus on global health. And so we try to advance many of our own programs, which are focused on low and middle income countries, as well as trying to coordinate and collaborate with other parts of the NCI towards having the NCI be as globally impactful as it can be. Next year is the 50th anniversary of the National Cancer Act of 1971. And we global health activity at the NCI really precedes the National Cancer Act. and dates back actually to the founding of the NIH and the NCI in the 1930s. However, next year will be the 50th anniversary of this really important legislative milestone in the United States, which really has made a lot of the progress that we've seen against cancer over the last 50 years possible. And throughout 2021, there will be a steady communication effort by the NCI and its partners really to commemorate the significance of the 1971 legislation. I've been revisiting this legislation recently and have really been delighted to know that there is an explicit legislative mandate for the NCI to be a global actor in the original language of the law. So among many things that the NCI director is instructed to do are included: collect, analyze, and disseminate all data useful in the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of cancer, including the establishment of an international cancer research data bank to collect, catalog, store, and disseminate, insofar as feasible, the results of cancer research undertaken in any country for the use of any person involved in cancer research in any country, and also to support research in the cancer field outside the United States by highly qualified foreign nationals, which research can be expected to inure to the benefit of the American people, support collaborative research involving American and foreign participants, and support the training of American scientists abroad and foreign scientists in the United States. So we're really excited in celebrating the 50th anniversary of the National Cancer Act next year in amplifying that message with those messages with many of our international partners, and also highlighting some of the important global health contributions that the NCI has made and weaving that into the overall story of the 50 years since the National Cancer Act. And shown at right is President Richard Nixon actually signing the 1971 law. So this is the FY19 NCI global portfolio. We've just completed FY20 and are doing these analyses now. But you can see that approximately 12% of the NCI extramural portfolio, that is grants made to external investigators by the NCI, includes an international component. Most of that is a foreign component award. So the direct award goes to a US institution and includes an international component or collaborator. A much smaller percentage are direct international awards. Shown here in the middle are the countries represented. Again, many of these are high income countries. The countries shown in green are low and middle income countries, where much of our focus is at the NCI Center for Global Health, and we're certainly interested in growing that part of the portfolio. And then at right are the geographic sweep of these extramural investments, which are really worldwide. And you'll be hearing about some specific examples of these from our other speakers. And then intramurally, there are two intramural divisions at the NCI. These are NCI scientists doing their own research, the Center for Cancer Research, where my adjunct appointment is, and then the Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics. And you can see that both intramural divisions at the NCI have a number of investigators who are engaged in international research. So I think the time today really doesn't allow to a comprehensive overview of the entire NCI global portfolio, nor even an overview of Center for Global Health programs. So what I've tried to do instead is really offer a few specific applied examples of the ways in which NCI supported research, I think, is really making a difference to global cancer control. And again, also to set up some themes that I think will be carried forward by our subsequent speakers. So one example is work in HIV-associated malignancies, and much of this is coordinated through the NCI Office of HIV/AIDS Malignancies. And I've just chosen one example of a large portfolio that they oversee. So for example, pomalidomide, through work done in Bob Yarshowen's group, recently received FDA approval for AIDS, for HIV-associated Kaposi sarcoma. And this was probably the first new treatment for this disease approved by the FDA in the United States in several decades. Many of you are familiar with pomalidomide, which is an oral, non-cytotoxic, non-myelosuppressive, well-tolerated agent, which in many respects might have attributes that would make it a very attractive treatment, particularly for sub-Saharan African settings where this disease is most common. Again, I showed you that several slides ago on the geographic map showing cancer incidence. So this is now being carried forward through the AIDS Malignancy Consortium, which is a cooperative clinical trials group supported by the NCI to study HIV-associated cancers, which has dramatically increased its international profile and capacity in recent years. Dr. Valeria Fink, who will be speaking shortly, plays a leadership role in the AMC and has really overseen expansion of activities at the Latin American sites, and this is something that she may speak about in her talk. I thought it would be also useful to offer a few concrete examples of the ways in which NCI-supported research is supporting the WHO cervical cancer elimination framework, especially given that this framework was launched officially this week on Tuesday. Again, as many of you are aware, this is a global project to eliminate a cancer from the face of the earth for the first time in history, which is remarkable, and really rests on three discrete pillars. The first is achieving 90% vaccine coverage for girls. The second is achieving 70% coverage for women with screening between ages 35 and 45. And the final piece is ensuring that 90% of women receive treatment for precancer or invasive cancer. And I think the NCI has made important contributions actually to each of these three pillars, which will underlie this unprecedented project in human history. So I was hired at the NCI by Doug Lowy, who was the acting director at the time. As many of you are familiar, he and John Schiller won the Lasker Prize last year for their work in developing the HPV vaccine, but that work is very much still ongoing to increase the worldwide applicability of that transformational technology for global cancer control. And this is just one example of work that Amy Kramer and other colleagues at the NCI have done in the NCI Division of Cancer Epidemiology and Genetics, focused on simplified vaccination schedules for the HPV vaccine. So these are data from an earlier randomized controlled trial in Costa Rica, which demonstrated that there's really durable antibody titers against HPV-16 and HPV-18 for as much as 11 years following vaccination in women who received just a single dose of the vaccine, and that these antibody titers are well above the threshold that's required for natural immunity. Now, these women were not randomized to receive a single dose, so this is really kind of observational data that is hypothesis generating rather than definitive, but there's an ongoing randomized controlled trial now in Costa Rica to definitively evaluate whether a single dose schedule would be sufficient, which one can imagine immediately reduces substantially the work required to achieve this 90% vaccine coverage worldwide. Similarly, there's ongoing work at the NCI focused on this second step to increase efficiencies of cervical cancer screening. Again, just as one example, I've shown a recent paper from Mark Schiffman and Nico Wensensen and others at the NCI. This is to use machine learning approaches and an automated visual evaluation algorithm applied to cervical images to predict the likelihood of precancer. Shown at left are ROC curves, and you can see that the ROC curve for the automated visual evaluation algorithm really substantially outperforms any of the other available methods that we have for cervical cancer screening, including cytology and HPV testing. So these investigators are already on to newer generations of this technology, using it to optimize its user friendliness on smartphones, introduce applications beyond just predicting the likelihood of precancer and validating and refining it in diverse populations around the world. And again, you can imagine as these efforts evolve and are successful, it will have real implications for the work that's required to achieve this second pillar towards the WHO cervical cancer elimination strategy. And then finally, again, the last pillar is really 90% coverage for treatment of invasive cancer and precancer. This is something that Dr. Basu will talk about in his talk. But we, through the Affordable Cancer Technologies Program, which we coordinate at the NCI Center for Global Health, I think have really helped accelerate the development of some novel technologies that will optimize achievement of this final pillar. Because as many of you are familiar, the currently available technologies like cryotherapy are really not workable solutions toward this final pillar that's required for cervical cancer elimination. So just to conclude, I also wanted to briefly highlight some of the important contributions that we are making for global cancer research training. So one of the things that we have done at the NCI Center for Global Health is work very closely with the cancer centers. The NCI has 71 designated cancer centers across the United States. And it has been clear that global oncology activities have grown dramatically at the cancer centers over the last decade, with approximately half of cancer centers now having a formal global oncology program. And in addition, there's a really marked uptick in the interest of trainees and faculty in international collaborations for global cancer research and control. However, that really had not been accompanied as we had worked with the cancer centers and conducted this survey periodically over the last decade, that really had not been accompanied by dedicated global cancer research training, really to build a diverse workforce that is really skilled in this new and emerging discipline. And that's something where we at the Center for Global Health, together with the Fogarty International Center, which has a 50-plus year history at the NIH of global health capacity building, particularly in LMICs, have worked together to try to address some of these global cancer research training shortfalls. And again, this is something that you may be hearing a little bit about from Dr. Marte in her talk. So finally, as the NCI, we like to continue sort of highlighting progress in the global oncology field and the ways in which these international collaborations really are advancing global cancer research. We're delighted to have the opportunity to host this session as part of London Global Cancer Week, which has been an amazing week of events really focused on this problem. We have an upcoming meeting, which I just wanted to make everyone aware about, which is the 9th Annual Symposium on Global Cancer Research. This is a meeting that we have been helping to organize and host really for the last decade, and has become one of the larger and longest running scientific meetings specifically focused on global cancer research. This will be a virtual meeting next March, which we will be hosting together with cancer centers, AACR, ASCO, the Consortium of Universities for Global Health. The call for abstracts is currently open, as is registration. So I hope many of you will consider attending this meeting and or submitting your work. So with that as those are my comments, and I really wanted to offer these as a prologue for what I think will be some really exciting talks from our other speaker. But in conclusion, for my section and really as prologue for what will come afterwards, I just wanted to say that, really what I hope to emphasize during these opening remarks was that the NCI commitment to global health is really long-standing. I think it's quite deep and really touches every part of the institution and is part of our core mission. I think this portfolio includes implementation science, translational technologies, clinical trials and career support in international settings for international investigators. And again, I think you'll be hearing more about this from our subsequent speakers. And we believe that this will continue to result in global cancer science that really benefits people everywhere. So with that, I'll stop. I think we have a couple of minutes for if there are any immediate pressing questions before we move on to our other speakers. So Kalina, Mishka, are there any questions that have come through that we should address immediately?
No questions yet, Satish.
Okay. So we have some time for panel discussion at the end. Again, as a reminder, people can continue to put their questions in the chat box. And I think we can go ahead probably and have Dr. Martai present and save questions then for the end.
So thank you so much for the invitation to present on this panel and for all of you who have registered for this session. So I'm going to talk more from a young investigator perspective and give some overview of how to build a career in global oncology research. The three things that I wanted to highlight over the course of this presentation is setting up an effective mentorship team as a young investigator in global oncology, building successful research partnerships, so equitable global health partnerships in global oncology. And then I'm going to end by giving some overview and examples of global cancer projects that have been funded for young investigators interested in global cancer research. So I have to admit that there's no cookie cutter approach to this. And so every lens in global oncology is slightly different. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about my path from global oncology and how I ended up in Botswana doing breast cancer research. So I am originally from Ghana, and I came to the US for college and medical school and further training. But my main interest in global oncology didn't start till maybe 2007 when I was in medical school. And so this was when global oncology was even lesser popular than it is now. But I wanted to study breast cancer presentation in Ghanaian women and examine delays in presentation. And I had no idea how to go about it. But I cold emailed Dr. Lopade, who set me up with a mentor in Ghana, Dr. Van der Poy. And I was co-mentored by her and Dr. Jones at Yale to conduct this project. And for me, I think it was a really productive summer. It was a project that was well funded. And it was my first insight into some of the disparities that exist in terms of global oncology, and also sparked my interest in thinking about global equity and how we deliver cancer care in low and middle income countries. And so over the course of my training, I wanted to incorporate that as part of my training. And so at UCSF, I went to Uganda. And I think, I had the experience of working along with colleagues who were NIH-funded researchers in global oncology. And I think that for me planted the seed that this was a viable research field that I could pursue. And so in thinking about fellowship, I wanted to be at a program that thought about global oncology not as a pet project, but really thought about global oncology as a serious career field, was invested in it, and was interested in expanding its global health footprint into cancer space. And so that's how I ended up at Penn. I think the thing to highlight for a lot of young investigators, which I learned, is that in global oncology, it's really critical to actually have an existing partnership and an alignment of your institution's strength and a locally relevant topic with your research goals in order to be successful. So what I mean by that is that you can't really drop a pin on a map and just go do global oncology. And at the same time, you can't really focus on a project that your institution isn't invested in or that isn't locally relevant to the context. So that's sort of unique thinking about global oncology. And so I arrived at Penn at a time when there was already an established Botswana-UPenn partnership that had an extensive program in HIV research for about 15 years and was looking to expand its focus in cancer research. I was also fortunate to have different faculty members who had been recruited to Penn at that time who were interested in global cancer research. And so that for me was fortunate. And so, my institution was invested, which meant there was funding available. I had protected time to actually do this work and travel, which I think was really critical in the initial stages. I also have to say that in doing global oncology research, it's also important that whatever you want to study is locally relevant. And so in thinking about breast cancer, this was an area that hadn't received as much attention as HIV or cervical cancer in Botswana. And so I remember looking at different publications in PubMed, and HIV in Botswana comes up with more than 1,000 publications. And breast cancer in Botswana has just about a dozen publications. And so for me, this highlighted that even though contextually this was a serious problem, it was under addressed, and this was an area that could potentially be studied further and a potential niche for me. And so I have talked about sort of the environmental commitment to the candidate. I have to say, just to set the stage, that in order to be a successful young investigator, you absolutely have to get funded. This is something that my mentors have sort of highlighted over the years. But I think, you have to be productive in terms of publication as well, but funding is absolutely necessary. And I think in the initial stages, before you have your own grant, it's really important that you have an institution that is invested in you and that is willing to give you the support to be able to do this. The candidate and research plans differ a little bit. And when I give you an idea of projects that have been funded, you will get some insight into sort of different approaches people have taken in global oncology research. What I wanted to highlight with my talk is really the importance of mentorship in global oncology. It's absolutely critical, but I must say that because not all NCI designated institutions currently have a huge focus on global oncology, it's hard to find mentors who do exactly what you want to do in the global health context. And so I think for me, mentorship has been critical in terms of being intentional about selecting a team that is actually going to fill in different gaps in your training skills, but then also having a team that has the local context. And so what does a mentorship team look like? So there's an African proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child. Really, it's taking an intercontinental mentorship team to get where I am. This is not my active mentorship team at this time point, but these are people who've mentored me at different time points during my transition to become a young faculty member and also in my research projects in Botswana. I think what I've been fortunate to have is really a mentorship team that is cohesive to begin with and that are already interconnected in their different ways. And so Dr. D. Michelle is a breast cancer clinical trialist, clinical epidemiologist, who was my breast cancer mentor as a fellow. And it turns out that her husband actually does HIV work in Botswana, and so studies pharmacoepi adherence in HIV positive patients in Botswana, and is actually transitioning into looking at tobacco cessation among people living with HIV in Botswana. And he had mentored Dr. Mosapele before. And so I think I arrived at a time where, there was already rapport in terms of the connections between my mentorship team, but also fostered well in terms of how well I was mentored. And I think this is absolutely critical in terms of how I've been able to advance in my research career. So just to highlight what I think are critical components, especially when you start thinking about effective mentorship in the global oncology space, I think it's important to, first of all, I can't say enough that you have to really be at an institution that thinks your global oncology research career is not a pet project, just because your mentorship is going to reflect that as well. And so in thinking about senior mentorship, this definition of mentorship, I think, sort of highlights some points that I wanted to stress upon. So an activity in which more senior or experienced people who have respect and power within their fields take more junior or less experienced colleagues under their care to teach, encourage, and ensure mentee success. And so in looking at experienced people, I wanted mentors who've actually had a track record in mentoring young investigators from mentored career research projects to being independent investigators. And a plus was that I actually had mentors who had done this for people who were doing global health research. And so for me, I knew these were people who were experienced in sort of balancing the context, the US context, but someone who was predominantly interested in studying research ideas or research questions within a global health context. Respect and power, teach and encourage, this goes without saying. I also wanted to find mentors who, wanted to ensure my success. And so people who believe that global oncology was a viable research field. And I think that, to me, was probably one of the critical factors. I know there are a lot of people in global oncology who struggle a lot, especially young investigators, in getting mentors. And sometimes you might think that some mentorship is better than none, but there's data to show that, that is not necessarily true. And so, just as a side note, this is a survey of 500 faculty members, I think, at the MGH. And as you would expect, high quality mentorship leads to, decreased likelihood of being stalled in rank, increased likelihood of job satisfaction. It turns out, though, that having low quality mentorship has a similar relationship to job satisfaction as not having a mentor. And especially in global oncology, where this is an emerging field, it's still a pretty small niche. And an area where senior mentors are sort of scarce and just scattered around different institutions, it's even more important to make sure that your mentorship is really of high quality. And so I will tell you a little bit about how I built my oncology research team. And so my current project is looking at fidelity and adaptation of breast cancer resource stratified treatment guidelines in Botswana. And leading up to this, I had I am clinical epi trained, and I've done a lot of work looking at breast cancer therapy delivery. And so looking at suboptimal therapy delivery, how patients adhere to treatment schedules, and then also looking at how providers adhere to treatment guidelines. And so I had been able to collect data sort of documenting that there's suboptimal therapy delivery. And as I was thinking about breast cancer resource stratified guidelines being deployed in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, I wanted to think sort of more in terms of the implementation science field, in using rigorous frameworks to measure how we adapt these guidelines to the local context, A, and then B, how we can design interventions to actually try to increase fidelity to these guidelines. And so my prior research had really focused on breast cancer and HIV alone, and my mentorship team reflected that. You know, I had Dr. Gross, who was HIV predominantly based, and then Dr. Schulman and Dr. Angie D. Michelle, breast cancer, and Dr. Mosopele, really focusing on HIV and NCDs. But once I decided that, you know, I think really thinking about how to make the most impact in the global oncology space and how my research could really translate into increased survival, I knew I had to get more skills in implementation science. And so I included people on my mentorship team who were implementation science trained. And so, you know, these are people who have mixed methods in implementation science background and then also implementation science skills and are very well published in the field. And I think it's important within the global oncology space that your mentorship team is really chosen intentionally and not just putting people together because they're famous or because, you know, they're well published in global oncology, but people who actually have the experience doing that sort of research. And then I just wanted to wrap up by giving, you know, some examples, some, you know, caveats for how to build an effective mentorship team. So I think effective communication is absolutely necessary. Zoom has absolutely transformed that. But I think the challenge with global oncology and travels is that you have to, you know, balance different time zones and be in frequent communication with your mentors, but also have frequent feedback locally from local experts, as well as US experts. And I think, you know, when you get feedback, obviously take those feedback seriously, setting clear goals and expectations. In my case, my mentors were like, you have to get funding to be successful, fostering independence, promoting professional development, addressing diversity. For me, this has been important as a woman of color in global long space doing research. This is like a very small percentage of people who do the sort of research I do and who look like me, who do this kind of work. And so addressing that and then also addressing cultural competency, especially when you think about global oncology, is absolutely necessary. So in terms of building successful research partnerships, and you absolutely need it to be successful in global oncology as a young investigator, you have to engage in global health. And so there are people who do global health and travel into country like a week a year, which, you know, is you know, people do that. I think in order to be successful, really, you have to engage in global health. You have to be on site. You have to partner with people on the ground. You have to engage in clinical care. And I think that a lot of the questions that you develop after doing that become very clinically relevant after having spent an extended period of time in the context. And so I've been to Botswana for a substantial amount of time now over the last 5 years. I haven't traveled recently, obviously, because of the pandemic. And then also you have to think about developing equitable global health partnerships, right? And so these are a few pictures to illustrate, you know, people I've partnered with over time. And so this is a picture from our MSc program. So my mentor, Dr. Gross, had a D43 grant that supported young investigators from Botswana to do an MSc program at Penn. And so these were my classmates, people I worked with. And have continued to bounce research ideas off of. But these were people who, you know, were based in Botswana and returned to Botswana to do research. And then Dr. Ralefala is the head of the oncology program at Princess Marina Hospital, who I work with very closely in the clinical space and then also in the research space. Dr. Masire was the head of the Botswana UPenn partnership when I arrived. And it was really instrumental having a program that was already set up, but then also have a program where the director was already, you know, intertwined with a local context and could open doors in terms of, you know, establishing partnerships for me, giving me credibility and you know, helping, you know, people build their trust in me as a potential partner equitable partner in research. It's also important to build a research team. So as a young investigator, I have like a very small core research team, but I think it's not the size that matters. It's really the quality of your research team and investing in local talent. And I must say, I've just had an amazing time in the last couple of months working with this team of research personnel, because we've had to think really creatively about how we continue research in the pandemic while mitigating the risk of, COVID infection. And the team has been really creative in doing that. And, as an example, we had a lot of interviews scheduled to be in-person interviews. And now we're conducting a lot of phone interviews for our qualitative research projects, which have actually increased the participation rate and access for patients. And so it's actually worked out really well. And this is just one example of an area where, when you build a research team and invest in personnel, it actually works in your favor. My research manager is Lebohan Mokokwe. So she is actually also getting a PhD in improvement science. So sort of similar to implementation science, but a little bit different. And this has been co-funded by the Botswana UPenn partnerships as well. So this is an example of sort of how you invest in local talent. And so I'm going to wrap up by giving an overview of some NCI-sponsored global cancer mentored research opportunities. So this is data. I just want to thank the Center for Global Health for pulling up this data for me. But this is data from 2019 to 2020. So these are all K-funded projects. So I should preface this by saying there are definitely a lot more funded projects, especially for independent investigators, but specifically focusing on career development awards. There were 617 funded primarily or secondarily by the NCI. Of these, 33 included a foreign component. And I went through the abstract and looked at projects that specifically had an LMIC component. So I labeled these global oncology research projects. And there were 12 of these. And so about 2% of the total number. So not great, but I think it's probably a number that's going to expand over the next couple of years. And so these are different types of K grants. And then some of them are actually funded primarily by the Fogarty International Center, which has funding for U.S. citizens, but then also some funding for non-U.S. citizens as well. In terms of where projects have been funded, so of the 12 projects, I think there was one in Mexico, one in Jamaica, but most of them were actually in sub-Saharan Africa. And these are the years of funding date, the start dates for the funding available. And so 2018 had like a lot of projects that were actually initiated and funded by the NCI. This is a small data set, so I wouldn't call this a trend, but just to give you a flavor of how many projects get funded every year through the NCI targeting global oncology. And then just to end, I wanted to give you an example of some currently funded projects. So there isn't, like I said, there's no like one way to do this. And there are projects that have been funded in genetics, implementation science, pharmacoepi, clinical epi. And so, and the disease areas are actually also very different. So projects being funded in liver disease, breast cancer, HPV, Burkitt's lymphoma in different sites. And this data is actually available on the NCI website. And so if you wanted to look at a more extended list of other projects that have been funded, you could easily pull this up. And that's it for me. I just wanted to say, I've given a shout out to a lot of these people, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to some of my Penn-based, Botswana-based mentors, and then also I've been fortunate to have a lot of funding support for a lot of my research work, which I wanted to acknowledge as well. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Marte. I think if there are questions for her, people could put them in the chat and we'll try to address those as a group at the end. Otherwise, Dr. Basu, if you would be willing to.
Thank you so much, Satish. Let me try to share my screen. Okay. Thank this for the opportunity. What I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes or so is present how an NI helped us address a very important question from policy perspective globally as far as cervical precancer is concerned. And I will also present that one research, how it has helped us in research questions and further collaborations. So about 10 years back, when we came out with this guideline that cryotherapy can be used to treat cervical precancers, especially in low and middle income countries, we thought we have done a lot of work to solve the problem of treating cervical precancers in low and middle income countries. Little did we realize that translating research findings to a real health system has several challenges, and exactly that we can see in the picture on the right hand side. This is a clinic that provides screening and treatment in Zambia. When I say screening, it is screening for cervical cancer. And you can see the tank of cryotherapy. This tank contains refrigerant gas, nitrous oxide, which is very, very difficult to procure. They have to get it from South Africa. And this huge cylinder, it is very difficult to carry across the countries or even from one center to another. So what happened in Zambia in this particular clinic, this tank was procured once. The gas was exhausted in a couple of months, and they stopped using cryotherapy. So that is the situation not only in Zambia, but most in low and middle income countries, that they find implementing cryotherapy to treat cervical precancers a huge challenge. So what we did about 5 years back was to look at the horizon and see what other options are there. And we realized that there was a treatment method which was not exactly new. This is called thermal ablation or thermocoagulation, was being used in a couple of centers in Scotland, in a center in Singapore. So we thought, let us look at this particular technology and see how best we can evaluate it and see whether it will have a real value in low and middle income countries as far as treatment of cervical precancers is concerned. So as you know, any research starts with building the right team. And we have in the team Professor Grosbeck Parham. He is a passionate advocate. He is an expert gynec-oncologist. At the time, he has real understanding of the field situation in sub-Saharan Africa. We have Dr. Shankar Narayanan. He was my predecessor at the International Agency for Research on Cancer in the cervical cancer prevention. I joined with my background of being a gynec-oncologist, a colposcopist, and doing field-based research in cervical cancer prevention. We have in our team Professor Walter Prendeville. He is not only a very renowned colposcopist and trainer, but also he is an inventor himself. He invented the LEAP treatment. And in the team, we have Dr. Dean Wallace, who is a biophysicist himself. He is an inventor and he is an entrepreneur. Absolutely a dream team, and also highlighting the fact that these days research collaboration has to have private partnership as an integral part of it. So with this team, we decided to develop the research protocol and applied for funding, and we received the funding from the NIH. So essentially, the study was to develop this particular technology. When we started, the machine that you are seeing on the right-hand side, it is called thermal ablator. That was in a purely prototype phase. So from a prototype, what we did was we did bench testing on chicken breast to see whether it was really being able to, destroy the tissue. Then we did on women. Initial study was on the women who were under anesthesia, were about to undergo hysterectomy, And in them, we applied this particular technology to see whether it was being able to destroy the cervical epithelium as much as we want without causing any undue complication. And from that, once we were this kind of the bench studies and preclinical studies, we decided to go for a randomized control trial, which is an initial pilot randomized control trial, which is called UH2 pilot phase. And then once we've completed the UH2 pilot phase successfully, we graduated to the UH3 RCT. So what I will do is to give you a flavor of the UH2 study outcomes. So this UH2 study, essentially it compared the new technology to standard of care. The standard of care for treating cervical precancers is cryotherapy in most low and middle income countries and LEEP or LEDs in a higher resourced setting. So we have 3 arms, and women who were positive on VIA screening, they were randomized to either of these 3 arms. The study is being implemented in the Zambia, integrated to the real health setting. Before treatment, every woman has an HPV test done. After treatment, we do follow-ups to identify if they have had any serious adverse events, document the adverse events, and recall them after 6 months when we do another VIA test and HPV test to see what proportion of them have become normal. Some data that I am going to present. Essentially, I will highlight the fact that 250 women were treated in each of the arms, and out of these women, 750 women, more than 50% were HIV positive. And in these women, when we compare the pain or discomfort by different treatment methods, as you can see, for either of the treatment methods, the pain or discomfort, anything beyond least pain, was very rare. And you can see that the rates are exactly same between cryotherapy, thermal ablation, and LEDs. So this gave us the confidence that this is safe, this is acceptable. We also looked at other adverse events and there was no difference. Now, at follow-up, what we are doing is we are doing VIA and HPV testing. Now, when we design a study and when we work in different settings, we have to be pragmatic. We need to understand the ground situation. And the ground situation in Zambia was that it was very difficult to get histopathology done on so many women. So what we decided was to go for our very study-specific outcome of cure. That is, if somebody was HPV positive at baseline, she should be HPV negative at follow-up. Then we'll consider her to be cured. If somebody was HPV negative, but was, of course, she was VIA positive, and if she becomes VIA negative, then we'll consider her to be cured. So this is a little different way of assessing the treatment outcomes, but our biggest strength was that we could compare cryotherapy, thermal ablation, and LEDs using the same criteria. And when we use same criteria of cure, we can see that at follow-up, there is no difference in the outcome between cryotherapy, thermal ablation, and loop excision. And when we look at the patients, stratified by their age, among the women who are HIV negative, definitely the cure rate was higher. But then among the HIV positive women, you can see the significantly lower cure rate, irrespective of the type of treatment that you are using. That led us to think, what exactly is different in these women, HIV positive women who are on ART, that is giving this low cure rate. So from that point, we started looking at different research questions. And as a pilot study, we have started a new sub-study to look at the microbiome and the metabolome, which is the vaginal environment, to see whether that can be something that is precipitating the factor to explain this difference in cure rate. So that is a sub-study we are doing, which is again supported by a supplement from NIH. But more important was that this data was very, very important when we came out with the latest WHO guideline for thermal ablation in 2019. So last year, these data, especially the safety data and then the efficacy data from screen and treat setting, this was the only randomized study that was ever implemented in a screen and treat setting to see how good is thermal ablation. And this guideline came out with the recommendation that thermal ablation can be used in sport to treat cervical precancer because it is as good as cryotherapy. And then we helped in dissemination. We worked with the Unitaid that is now looking at scaling up of this technology in several settings. But at the same time, in any case, it has been adopted by large programs like in China, in India, also in many sub-Saharan African countries. This has been used. You can see this is these are the nurses who are using this technology in a small sub-Saharan African country, Benin. So from the research study, we have generated evidence, and from evidence, we are now working to disseminate the new technology so that it serves the purpose for which it was developed, that is to save women from cervical cancer. But then when we develop the guidelines, the one key question in any guideline is that how cost effective is this new intervention as compared to others? And when we look at the evidence, you can see the evidence is blank. When we came out with the recommendation, this evidence was not there. There is no evidence to say that thermal ablation is more cost effective or less cost effective than cryotherapy. So it was the recommendation was based on expert advice. That is not the ideal thing. So now we have again, come up with a team. That team includes Dr. Natalie Brute from WHO headquarters, who is one of the leaders in the elimination activities that is ongoing. We have Jacopo Busano from my institution. Jacopo is a modeler and has an excellent cervical cancer natural history model. And we have teamed up with the University of Washington at Seattle, Dr. Darcy Rao and their team. They are going to help us in economic evaluation. We have submitted this for supplementary grant, but then we are really not waiting for the grant because this is an opportunity to collect data. We are collecting data from the field. And hopefully, if we get the grant, we'll be able to put it in the model and then do the proper cost effectiveness analysis. So as we did this research, we learned lessons. The most important lesson that we learned was that, yes, when you have developed a team, you need to bring this team with a common purpose. Of course, the common purpose was quite obvious. We wanted to do the study and address the research questions. But then a regular and transparent communication between the members is very important. And the members should have shared values in terms of having a common goal of saving lives and doing research with appropriate ethical rigor. That is also very, very important. We have faced troubles, difficulties, but we reflected on this, sat together and found solutions. And this probably I would identify as the most important to keep the collaboration ongoing. A mutual respect for and giving due credit to people to whom it is due. And to us, I think the last word is for any research collaboration, the most important work is done by the people on the field. The nurses who are actually doing the treatment, the social worker who are counseling the women, and the women themselves who are participants of our research study. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Partha, for an amazing talk. Again, if there are questions for Dr. Basu, if folks could enter those in the chat, and we'll have some time to address those at the end. Otherwise, I'd love to invite Dr. Fink to present her talk.
Okay. Can you see it right?
We can see that it's not in presentation. There you go. Yep.
Okay. Okay. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. First of all, I want to thank the invitation to Dr. Satish Gopal for participating in this very interesting session. And honestly, listening to my previous presenting was very inspiring and actually find a lot of things in common that I'm going to go back during my presentation. So my name is Valeria Fink. I'm from Fundación Huésped, Argentina. I'm an ID physician, and I will talk about how international research networks really help us to build capacity and to form our human resources into knowledge. So this actually was a bit introduced by Dr. Gopal in his presentation, and this is just a couple of numbers to show the disparity between the high-income countries and the low and middle-income countries when we are talking about investment in research. On one side, it's clear with this number, which is the gross national product invested from each of the regions. And another thing that's many times comes out, it's the fact about publications. So these are just numbers from one study presented in the Lancet Global Health that used data from publications from actually a global health journal from 2013 until 2017. And as you see, only 35% of the authors came from low and middle income countries, while over 90% of the publications were addressing interventions in these settings. And these are, I guess, the challenges that we find, and in different ways it has been presenting in the previous presentations when we try to think about research in different settings. But we are well aware that if we want better health, and that requires research in health, and as it was said, this research has to be done by everyone and by all the countries. The WHO actually in 2013, in the World Health Report, talking about universal health coverage, stated that all nations should be producers of research as well as consumers of research. And it became clear also at the UN Sustainable Development Goals that the capacity building and sharing this possibility in the lower and middle income countries of doing their own research, it's also a thing of equity and social justice. And actually, many of the international collaborative research partnerships actually bring a kind of bridge to these gaps in research that may happen in low and middle income countries. So, as I said, I'm an ID, and when we started thinking about this session, I said, well, I perhaps have like a different road, a different way to cancer. We are well aware that HIV has been very intertwined to cancer from the very beginning of the epidemic, after the very close relationship between Kaposi sarcoma and HIV. And along the time, we started to see that actually HIV and cancer are very linked and keep on being very linked, not only because of the HIV-associated and non-associated malignancies, but because this is now a very big problem due to the morbidity and mortality that cancer had in the HIV population, and that's actually a problem both in the low and in the high income settings. And when we start seeing this, there were a lot of gaps, in particular in some low and middle income settings, and I can say that Latin America, it's a kind of gap many times, because I usually say we don't have that high burden of disease, but we don't have that low burden of disease. And we are in some of our countries in this intermediate situation that many times it's harder even to explore what's going on there. And that's actually when there's a gap. We have to think that as an opportunity. So how did I got from the HIV world to the cancer world? Actually, when I finished my residency in ID in a general hospital, I started to became interested in some issues that we haven't solved. And one of the things was cervical cancer prevention in our women. Our HIV patients were not making it to the cervical cancer prevention service. So we decided to start a clinic integrated to the ID service with a gynecologist, and that started to bring a lot of interest for me in HPV and cancer prevention. And afterwards, we started to work with coloproctologists and doing also some work in anal disease. And one thing brought to another, and we had a couple of local support, local fellowships from our Argentinian National Cancer Institute. And all of this started giving the opportunity of thinking about being part of other networks. So actually this was my first, I would say my first NIH network, which was CasaNet, which is a network to study the HIV epidemics within South America and the Caribbean, first led by Dan Macy's and now by Kathy McGowan. And actually this is part of IDEA, which is an NIH initiative, which includes a lot of institutes, including the National Institute of Cancer. And this was really, and it's still a very good experience where I could interact with a lot of more experienced people, not only physicians, but also statisticians. And I had a very strong mentorship that could lead me for my first paper, which was describing the HIV cancer cases in Latin America. And that couldn't have been possible without the support of the network and of the statistician. So after this, some years later, while I was at the NIH presenting at that time, it was still the ICMAOE meeting, one Argentinian researcher working at Miami University, which is Enrique Mesri, came and said, "Hey, Valeria, you are working with Dr. Khan. He is my boss. He's an HIV researcher. He's a well-known HIV researcher." And he said, "Well, you're working with cancer, and I have some ideas about what we could do together." And actually, he's a basic science person, and he started building what afterwards became a U54 grant between the University of Miami and many institutions in Argentina. And I like this picture because it's in a field, in a basketball field. And that day, it was after a training we had in Miami, and we said, we have a team. And we are still working on together and trying to now to put forward many of the information that we collected and continue working on our projects. And actually, this U54 consortium had a lot of translational science involved. It was a way of knowing people from many other disciplines, not only references from the for cancer, like in anal cancer and Kaposi, because that's our main issue in this project. But one thing that it actually joined institutions from our own country. So we had to have someone from outside to put together reference centers in Argentina, working together in different projects. And actually, this has a very big training and career enhancement program that has been going on from the very beginning of the project. And a couple of years later, the AIDS Malignancy Consortium decided that they would expand their international resources to Latin America. Until that time, it was present in sub-Saharan Africa and a couple of sites in India. But they decided they would come to Latin America, and they visit several sites. And our institution was selected along with other 3 institutions to become part of the AIDS Malignancy Consortium. And one thing that is interesting, this is the press release when we have these 4 new sites in Latin America. And I wanted to highlight this, and it's with the addition of these new sites, the AMC mission will be expanded to leverage and build upon HIV and cancer treatment to address local cancer management issues in HIV people living in Latin America and South America. And I think this is a very important thing to have the support from an institution from the US to address local issues and to develop the teams at the sites. And these are just some of the things that are very important for the AMC, and that's the possibility of participating in clinical trials that will bring evidence, as Satish showed at the very beginning of the symposium. There's a component of training, and we have been living that within the AMC in particular. For instance, for anal cancer prevention, we have had equipment and we have had training for our providers for anoscopies. There's a fellowship program, and actually there's a very good integration that it's getting, I think, better and better for the international sites in all the decisions. And actually we had now 2 associate chairs, one for Latin America, which is myself, Warren Phipps, it's for Sub-Saharan Africa, and Satish actually was the former associate chair for Sub-Saharan Africa. And we are having more visibility within this network that is really great. So as Dr. Maite said, there are a lot of opportunities from NIH sponsor networks and actually NIH sponsor grants. And if you get into the website, you have 4 researchers, juniors researchers, seniors researchers, 1 institutions, collaborations, 1 project, multiple projects, and to get prepared for another grant. There are a lot of things. And so I think that we should visit quite frequently, and that's something that all of us who live outside many times do need to get used to all the numbers. I have been learning in the latest year, being involved in several NIH studies. And these are the challenges. I think that we need to find the right grant for our studies, to find the right support. And as Dr. Marte said, this go to have a good team, a good mentoring team, and also bear in mind the program officer from NIH to find the right partners and don't give up. Perhaps it's not the first time, it's not the second time, it might be the third or a different time, but continue trying. And it's a very learningful experience. So these are, in some way, I like this picture, it's actually air routes. But I feel sometimes that all these networks that we are building in some way are connecting us as planes. Now we are a bit restrictive, and we miss this in-person meeting, as we were talking at the beginning, saying that it's kind of rare being talking to a screen. But actually, that's the way it feels. It connects that a lot from the scientific point of view as well. And so these are the 3 networks that I would say I belong to: IDEA with CASANet, the U54 Consortium for Research and Training in Viral-Induced AIDS Malignancy with the University of Miami, and the AIDS Malignancy Consortium, all of them having to do with the National Cancer Institute. But actually the place where I work, I said I'm an ID. So we have been able to participate in other networks like the HPTN, the HIV Prevention Trial Network, the HIV Vaccine Trial Network, and now we are part of the COVID-19 Prevention Network dealing with vaccines. And actually from each of these networks, we've learned a lot, and I'm going to go to go back in the next slides. So these are just other training opportunities, the Fogarty grants, and it has been already addressed, the ARC and other NGOs that may bring many possibilities to all of you to present your studies. And don't forget about local opportunities. Many times what it happens to us is that perhaps there are smaller grants, but they could be the seed to work with other local institutions and to begin your project, and then with that being able to move forward to bigger projects and international collaboration. So I'm starting to get to my my last set of slides, which is how all this participation improved our local capabilities and reinforced our researcher skills. And actually, the career enhancement program is being present both at the U54 and at the AMC, and this really has been great, and it's still happening actually with fellows and with projects going on. The peers and the interdisciplinary interaction and experience exchange, all participating in all of these networks have had the opportunity not only to working with people within our own network, but with people from other sites. For instance, we had a great U54 meeting when we were still able to travel in March 2019, when we were able to interact with other U54 consortiums working maybe in similar issues as we were. So we can still continue to build bonds within the different institutions. The capacity building, and that's really an important issue because at least in our experience, getting into one network, for instance, required us to modify our institution. And so we had to modify the pharmacy due to one of the networks. And then we finally had an NIH compliant pharmacy, and that would open doors to more, to applying to other networks and other research studies. And it's also something to bear in mind that many times the network give you the money to improve your infrastructures. And the other thing, and I think this is a very important thing, it's about improving processes and quality in all your work, and that makes it easier to interact and be to the level of expectation when we are working with within international networks. So this will get a better science in our own country, and my advice would be try to contact your national centers, your national reference centers, include your reference lab experts that can help you to go to the right way. Create a local network. Sometimes we realize that it's much harder to build a local network in some of the settings. To disseminate your results locally and to share opportunities with your team and within your country. And at the same time that we do this is to do better science across the globe. And I will go back with this global health perspective, trying to find the right partners, trying to find the unsolved regional and global problems that you think are affecting your site and you can help to address. Participation in international networks, to disseminate your results internationally. For us, many times, and in Latin America, it's sometimes a known problem to be able to publish in high impact journals, but we have to keep on learning, and participating in all these networks actually give us a lot of training and mentorship to be able to do this kind of publications, and also to share opportunities. So I'm a couple of minutes after my time, but I would like to thank all the people. These are all the networks, all my homes, I would say, at some point that had helped build my career and that have been participating in all the networks that we are doing. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Valeria, and also Partha and Yehuda for some really outstanding talks. I think when we were approached by the London Global Cancer Week organizers, we were really hoping to put together a session that really spoke, it was not encyclopedic, but rather illustrative, and really showcased some of the really impactful projects and investigators that the NCI is supporting across a breadth of thematic areas. So I think your talks were really exemplars of that. We have about 10 minutes for questions. A couple of questions have come in through the chat. So the first one perhaps would be best posed to Yehuda and also Valeria. There's a question that came through specifically about engaging the advocacy community in research, and also advice that you would have for mentors. So I think both of you have sort of spoken to the experience of growing up in an academic global cancer research career as mentees, and are now mentoring others. But what advice would you give to mentors specifically? So engagement of the advocacy community in research, and then advice to mentors in global oncology. Yehuda, maybe you first.
Yeah, so I think advocacy, as I'm doing more of implementation science, I'm realizing that advocacy is actually like a critical component of it. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities to actually collaborate, thinking about advocacy within the implementation science context, and also thinking about funding within implementation science. And so the things that come to mind are thinking about more sort of community-based participatory research. Also, when you look at a lot of implementation science frameworks, there's the need to examine the local context and the individuals. And I think this is where advocacy can actually play a huge role in expanding, translation of policy into practice, and then also thinking about translation of evidence-based medicine into practice. And so I think absolutely important to have an advocacy component. And then the second part was with advice for mentors. So haven't really been on the other side of things, but I think the things that have helped me really is just having mentors who were absolutely dedicated. And so my mentors are all, NIH funded, independent investigators, super busy. But I think what I appreciate is that, every other week I'm able to meet with them. And so really investing not just, on paper, like the time to actually meet, but then in practice as well, being able to dedicate the time to actually meet. And then critically, I've been able to convene them sort of every quarter. So having different mentors in the same space, as opposed to me relaying messages between like different mentors. And I think that has been absolutely critical. Zoom obviously has changed that landscape. So it's much, much easier now. But I think really, just really investing the time is, I would say, most paramount, and then everything else follows along.
Valeria, did you want to add anything?
Not much, but I think that the advocacy it's really very important, and we do need to interact also with the community to address which are the local needs. And well, I guess that's part of our institutions and part of ourselves as researchers when we are trying to bring an answer for the people, which is actually where the reason we are working for is to give better health for the people. So I think that's very important, and I agree with the mentoring. That's a very big issue. We need to have someone to follow on your research work and to meet you quite at least on a regular basis, so you can be following on what you're doing. So sometimes it's hard to get one. I like the slide stating that sometimes one bad mentor was, and no mentor was more or less the same. And I think it's to find the right person.
Great, thanks both. So there's another question, a couple of questions specifically related to HPV and cervical cancer. So maybe part one came through to me, but Partha, would be great to hear your thoughts. So the first question was about the higher persistence rate in HIV positive women undergoing thermal ablation. Do you think that is primarily due to immunodeficiency or to reinfection? That's one question. And then there's a sort of related question about optimizing HPV vaccine coverage in LMICs in India particularly, so which came through to me, but I think your thoughts would be really valuable there too.
Thanks, Satish, and thanks, Arnie, for the questions. First, the natural history of cervical cancer in the HIV positive women, there are several research gaps at the moment. Certainly, their immunodeficiency plays a role in putting them at higher risk of having persistent infection. But then, does it really explain the 6 times higher risk of them going into cervical cancer? And more importantly, even in our study, all the women were on ART, and most of them were on ART for quite significant amount of time. But then still we see the low cure rate. And has been even a recent meta-analysis, if I remember, it was last year, that looked at the risk of cervical cancer development in the HIV positive women on ART. And the results are very conflicting. So we really do not know how the ART and ART-induced, correction of immunodeficiency can help these women. So yes, so what we are doing at the present moment is the supplementary grant is not only looking at the metabolome or the vaginal microbiome, but we are also looking at all these factors: the CD4 count, the viral load, the duration of ART, so that we can generate some hypothesis that needs to be looked at more deeply. So that is my response to your first question. The second question is, India is the situation in India is very peculiar. On one hand, we have a country with the highest burden of cervical cancer. On the other hand, we have a country where the policymakers and even leaders in cervical leaders in cancer treatment are in a denial mode. So initially, they denied that the vaccine was safe. Now they say they accept probably that the vaccine is safe enough. Then they said that there is no evidence that this vaccine prevents cervical cancer. And now we have evidence coming from Swedish study that clearly shows that it is protecting against cervical cancer. So third thing they are hanging on to is that they are saying it is too expensive. So the answer to that will be, number one, the indigenous production of the vaccine in India and many in China, Brazil. It will definitely bring the cost of the vaccine significantly. And we are hopeful, as Satish has shown you, the NIH-sponsored randomized control trial. And we are also doing a cohort study to look at the efficacy of single dose of this vaccine. So the reduction of the number of doses from 2 doses to a single dose for this vaccine will not only reduce the cost, but also the complexities of logistics. So, and then there is good news even in India that 2 of the states that they have gone ahead and implemented the vaccination program in their state immunization programs. It is still not there in the national immunization program, but hopefully things will gradually move and things will gradually change. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Partha. I mean, just parenthetically, many of the things that you alluded to regarding politicization, vaccine nationalism, these are issues that are obviously playing out in a much more extreme and urgent way related to COVID-19, but it's interesting to see how there are elements of that too that, may be barriers that we need to overcome in relation to HPV vaccine coverage. So we're close to the end of time. There is a kind of fairly involved question related to global health equity, which I think is something that we're all thinking about in a renewed way, probably within our own institutions. I think that perhaps just to say, some of you may have quick comments about this, but certainly, I think the connection between larger equity discussions is something that's going on, and I think in a very deep way at the NCI. We are very clear at the Center for Global Health in the ways in which that's connected to the work that we do and are thinking about that in a very focused way. That's a long conversation where we're hoping to actually, convene some dedicated sessions around at upcoming scientific meetings to flesh some of those issues out further. I think just as a micro step, even in today's session, when we were invited for London Global Cancer Week, we really wanted to feature LMIC investigators who were working in LMICs rather than individual investigators from the NCI who may have international collaboration. So, I think that is probably too long for us to address in the remaining time. So perhaps we can just leave it there. With that, it is 10 o'clock. So I want to, again, the link for the recording is shown in the chat box. This will be available at our CGH website. I'd really like to thank Valeria and Yehuda and Partha for their exemplary work that they presented today. Really in some ways making the NCI looking very good by investing in people like you. And thanks again to the London Global Cancer Week for inviting us as the to host this session as part of what's been an amazing week of events. So we'll end there. Thanks very much, everyone, again for joining this morning.